My name is Claire Morgan. People always say every child is loved equally. I spent most of my life wondering if that was ever true in my family. If you enjoy emotional family dramas, unforgettable karma stories, and powerful life lessons, be sure to subscribe to Quiet Karma Stories. Every story on this channel reminds us that kindness, integrity, and patience always matter in the end. Growing up, there were only 2 daughters in our family. My younger sister, Sophia, and me. From the outside, we looked like a normal family. Inside, we lived very different lives. Sophia had always been the star. She was confident, ambitious, the kind of person who could walk into any room and instantly become the center of attention. By the time she was 30, she had built a fast-growing tech startup and was already being featured in business magazines. My parents couldn't stop talking about her. Our daughter is a brilliant entrepreneur. She's destined for incredible things. Every family gathering became another celebration of Sophia's success. Her achievements, her promotions, her expensive vacations, her growing business. Meanwhile, I was rarely part of the conversation. I wasn't famous. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't running a company. I was simply a high school history teacher. Every morning, I stood in front of a classroom filled with teenagers, hoping to inspire them to understand the past and build a better future. I loved my job. Seeing a struggling student finally believe in themselves meant more to me than any paycheck ever could. But to my parents, teaching wasn't impressive. It was ordinary. Whenever relatives asked what I was doing, my mother would smile politely and say, "Claire teaches history." Then, almost immediately, she would turn towards Sophia. But Sophia just signed another major business deal. Just like that, I disappeared from the conversation. After a while, I stopped expecting anything different. The only person who never made me feel invisible was my husband, Ethan. We had met years earlier through mutual friends. He was kind, patient, honest. The type of man who listened more than he spoke. To everyone else, Ethan was just a warehouse manager. A hard-working man with an ordinary job. My parents never tried to know him beyond that. At family dinners, they barely asked him a question. If they did, it usually sounded like this. "So, are you still working at that warehouse?" Ethan would smile politely. "Yes." That single answer always seemed to satisfy them. They had already decided who he was. There was no point trying to change their minds. What none of them realized was that Ethan never cared about impressing anyone. He believed that real success didn't need applause. It spoke quietly through actions. Sometimes I asked him if my family's attitude bothered him. He would simply smile and squeeze my hand. People are free to underestimate me. They're also free to discover they were wrong. At the time, I thought he was simply trying to comfort me. I had no idea those words carried a deeper meaning. Because hidden behind Ethan's quiet smile was a secret that no one in my family could have imagined. And before the year was over, that secret would change every one of our lives forever. The years passed. Nothing really changed. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every family barbecue, every anniversary dinner. The pattern was always the same. Sophia was celebrated. Ethan and I were tolerated. Whenever my parents invited the family over, I already knew what would happen before we even walked through the front door. Someone would ask Sophia about her latest business deal. Someone else would compliment her new luxury car. My father would proudly introduce her to friends. My youngest daughter built her company from the ground up. The room would fill with applause. Then someone would eventually notice Ethan and me sitting quietly in the corner. Oh. Claire's here too. It wasn't meant to sound cruel. But somehow. It always did. Ethan never complained. He greeted everyone with a smile. Helped carry food into the kitchen. Offered to clean up after dinner. He treated my parents with respect, even when they gave him very little in return. Instead of appreciating his kindness, they mistook it for weakness. One Christmas, while everyone exchanged gifts around the tree, my uncle asked Ethan about work. "So, Ethan, still working at the warehouse?" Ethan smiled politely. "I am." Before he could say anything else, my father laughed. "He's probably the most reliable warehouse manager in the state." A few people chuckled. Then my mother added, "At least someone has to move the boxes." More laughter followed. I looked at Ethan, expecting him to feel embarrassed. Instead, he calmly took another sip of his coffee. As though the comments hadn't touched him at all. Another time, during a summer family barbecue, Sophia began talking about expanding her company overseas. Everyone listened with admiration. When she finished, my father looked toward Ethan. "So, when are you finally going to do something with your life?" The backyard suddenly became quiet. Every conversation stopped. Everyone waited for Ethan's answer. He simply smiled. "I'm happy with the life I've built." My father shook his head. "Happiness doesn't pay respect." Then he said the words I would never forget. "You'll never become anything." The sentence hung in the air. Several relatives looked uncomfortable. A few quietly looked down at their plates. No one defended Ethan. Not one person. I felt my face burn with anger. "Dad. That's enough." He waved his hand dismissively. "I'm just being honest." Honest. That was always his excuse. As if cruelty somehow became acceptable when disguised as honesty. When we left that evening, I apologized to Ethan over and over again. "I'm so sorry. You shouldn't have to put up with this." He reached across the car and gently held my hand. "Claire. I married you. Not their opinions." His words brought tears to my eyes. "Doesn't it hurt?" He smiled softly. "Of course it hurts. I'm human. But I learned something a long time ago. People who measure others by their job title usually know very little about true success." I looked at him. "You never defend yourself." He shrugged. "I don't need to. The truth doesn't become more valuable because you announce it." I didn't fully understand what he meant. I thought he was simply choosing peace over conflict. I had no idea. Ethan was protecting something much bigger than his pride. For years, my family believed they knew exactly who my husband was. An ordinary warehouse manager. A man with no ambition. No future. No importance. They couldn't have been more wrong. Because in just a few weeks, my father's retirement gala would become the night they discovered the truth. And nothing in our family would ever be the same again. A few weeks later, my father announced he was hosting the biggest celebration our family had ever seen. After 40 years in the construction industry, he was retiring. The event would be held at one of the city's finest hotels. More than 150 guests were invited. Business partners. Old friends. Relatives. Community leaders. Former colleagues. To my parents, it wasn't just a retirement party. It was a chance to celebrate the family's success. Especially Sophia's. When Ethan and I arrived, the ballroom was already filled with laughter and music. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays. Everything looked elegant. Almost perfect. My mother greeted us with a quick smile. "I'm glad you made it." Then she immediately turned to welcome another important guest. "Nothing new." Ethan simply smiled. "Let's just enjoy the evening." For the next hour, we quietly sat at our table while everyone surrounded Sophia. People congratulated her on her company, asked for business advice, praised her achievements. Very few people even noticed Ethan and me. Eventually, dinner was served. As dessert plates were cleared away, my father walked onto the stage. The room erupted into applause. He adjusted the microphone and smiled proudly. "I want to thank every one of you for being here tonight." More applause followed. He spent several minutes talking about his career, his accomplishments, the importance of hard work. Then he began thanking family members one by one. He praised my mother for supporting him through the years. He thanked Sophia for becoming the business success every parent dreams of. The audience clapped enthusiastically. Finally, his eyes landed on me. "And then there's Claire." A few guests turned toward our table. My father forced a polite smile. "Our oldest daughter chose a much simpler life." The room grew quiet. I felt Ethan gently squeeze my hand beneath the table. Then my father looked directly at him. His smile disappeared. He laughed softly before speaking into the microphone. "Claire married the only man in this room with no future." The words echoed through the ballroom. For a moment, no one moved. No one laughed. The silence was painful. Several guests looked down at their tables. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. A woman near the front quietly shook her head. Even some of my father's closest friends looked embarrassed. Everyone knew he had crossed a line. I looked toward Sophia. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, a slow smile spread across her face. She lifted her glass as if she had just witnessed a victory. That smile hurt more than my father's words, because it reminded me that she had never once defended us. Not once in all these years. I looked at Ethan. His face remained calm. He didn't look angry. He didn't argue. He simply sat there, listening, as though insults no longer had the power to disturb his peace. My father wasn't finished. He pointed toward Ethan again. "I've always told Claire she deserved someone successful. But I suppose we can't all make good decisions." A few nervous laughs escaped from different corners of the room. Most guests remained silent. No one knew how to react. I felt my face burning with humiliation. Part of me wanted to stand up and leave. Another part wanted to confront my father in front of everyone. Before I could say anything, Ethan gently touched my hand. His voice was barely above a whisper. "It's okay." I turned toward him. "No. It's not." He smiled. The same calm smile I had seen countless times before. Then he quietly said something I didn't fully understand. "Sometimes, the loudest people know the least." I looked into his eyes. There was no anger. No fear. Only quiet confidence. As the applause slowly returned and my father continued his speech, none of the guests realized they had just witnessed the beginning of something none of us could have imagined. Because hidden behind Ethan's quiet smile was a secret worth more than $200 million. And within days, the people who laughed at him would discover exactly who he really was. The drive home was completely silent. Neither Ethan nor I spoke. The only sound inside the car was the steady rhythm of the rain against the windshield. I kept replaying my father's words in my mind. Claire married the only man in this room with no future. Each time I remembered them, they hurt all over again. The moment we walked into our house, I couldn't hold back my emotions any longer. I dropped my purse onto the kitchen counter and burst into tears. "I'm sorry," I whispered. So sorry." Ethan quickly walked over and wrapped his arms around me. "You have nothing to apologize for. I brought you into this family. And they keep hurting you because of me." He gently lifted my chin. "No, Claire. They hurt themselves. They just don't realize it yet." I looked into his eyes. For the first time in years, there was something different in them. Not sadness. Not anger. Determination. He took a slow breath. "I think it's time you knew the whole truth." I frowned. "What truth?" Without saying another word, Ethan walked into his home office. A few moments later, he returned carrying a small black folder. He placed it on the dining table. "I've been keeping something from you." My heart started racing. I had never seen that folder before. Ethan slowly opened it. Inside were legal documents, financial reports, company ownership records, and several magazine articles. He slid the first document toward me. Across the top, I read the words, "Anderson Ridge Capital Partners. Founder v. Chairman. Ethan Morgan." I blinked. Then looked back at him. This can't be real." He smiled softly. "It's real. I founded the company 12 years ago." I stared at him in disbelief. "But you work at a warehouse." "I do." He nodded. "I own the warehouse." For a moment, I couldn't even speak. Everything I thought I knew suddenly stopped making sense. Ethan sat beside me. "Years ago, after selling my first business, I started a private investment company. We invest in manufacturing, logistics, renewable energy, and technology." I looked through the reports with shaking hands. The numbers seemed impossible. Hundreds of millions in managed assets. Companies across several states. International investments. I finally whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" He smiled. "Because I wanted one person in my life who loved me for who I was. Not for what I owned." Tears filled my eyes again. "You thought I'd leave if I knew." He shook his head. "No. I knew you wouldn't. I simply wanted a normal life. I wanted peace." He leaned back in his chair. "My wealth has never defined me. My character does." I picked up another document. An independent financial statement. Near the bottom, one number caught my attention. Estimated personal net worth, over $200 million. I looked at Ethan in complete disbelief. $200 million. He nodded quietly. "More or less. And you've never told anyone." "Very few people know. I've always preferred staying out of the spotlight." Suddenly, everything made sense. Why he never reacted to insults. Why he never cared about proving himself. Why he remained calm while everyone else judged him. He already knew something my family never understood. Real success never needs permission. It never needs applause. And it never needs to announce itself. Ethan reached across the table and gently held my hand. "I never wanted your parents to discover the truth this way. But after tonight, I won't let anyone humiliate my wife again." I looked at him. "What are you going to do?" A quiet smile appeared on his face. "Nothing." I looked confused. "They'll discover the truth on their own. And when they do, they'll realize they never underestimated my money. They underestimated my character." At that moment, I had no idea how right he was. Because only 3 days later, The entire country would learn Ethan Morgan's name. And my family's world would never be the same again. 3 days passed after my father's retirement gala. Life slowly returned to normal. At least, that's what everyone believed. Ethan continued leaving the house every morning just as he always had. He wore the same simple clothes, drove the same pickup truck, and smiled the same quiet smile. Nothing about him suggested he was one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. Then Friday morning arrived. I was drinking coffee before school when my phone suddenly began buzzing. One notification after another. Text messages, emails, social media alerts. At first, I thought something terrible had happened. Then I opened the first message. It was from one of my coworkers. Claire, is your husband the Ethan Morgan? Confused, I clicked the attached link. My breath caught instantly. There, on the cover of American Business Weekly, was Ethan. Standing in front of a modern office building. Dressed in a tailored navy suit. The headline stretched across the page. The quiet billion-dollar investor, how Ethan Morgan built one of America's most successful private investment firms without seeking the spotlight. I stared at the screen. Even though I already knew his secret. Seeing the entire country celebrate him felt surreal. The article explained how Ethan had quietly founded Morgan Ridge Capital nearly 12 years earlier. How his investment company had helped rescue struggling businesses. Created thousands of jobs. Supported local communities. And donated millions of dollars to education and children's charities. Most people had never heard his name. Because he had deliberately stayed out of the public eye. Until now. The magazine interview spread across social media within hours. Business podcasts discussed his leadership. News websites shared his story. Television programs replayed clips from the interview all afternoon. By lunchtime, the interview had gone viral. Then my phone rang. Mom. I ignored it. A few seconds later, Dad called. Then Sophia. Then my aunt. Then my cousin. One after another. I didn't answer. An hour later, my mother left a voicemail. Her voice was shaking. Claire. Please tell me this isn't the same Ethan. Before I could even process that message, another voicemail arrived. This time from my father. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? I quietly put my phone down. What could I possibly say? They had never asked who Ethan really was. They had already decided who he was. Later that afternoon, Sophia finally called again. This time, I answered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered. Claire. Tell me it's fake. It can't be him. I looked across the room. Ethan was reading a book as calmly as if nothing had happened. I smiled. No. It's real. She let out a nervous laugh. You're joking. The warehouse manager. He owns Morgan Ridge Capital. That's impossible. I quietly replied. You never really knew him, Sophia. The line went silent. Finally, she asked the question I had expected. How much? Is he actually worth? I glanced toward Ethan. He simply smiled. I answered honestly. More than $200 million. The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds. Then, the call disconnected. She hadn't even said goodbye. That evening, the magazine interview appeared on every television in the country. My parents watched it together in complete silence. My father replayed the interview twice. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. Neither of them could believe what they were seeing. The man they had mocked for years. The man they had called a nobody. The man they claimed had no future. Was being praised as one of the nation's most respected business leaders. And for the first time, they realized they had never been looking down on an ordinary man. They had been looking down on a man whose success was greater than anything they had ever imagined. But what hurt them the most wasn't discovering Ethan's wealth. It was realizing that despite everything they had said, he had never once tried to embarrass them in return. And very soon, they would come knocking on our front door. Not to apologize, but because they desperately needed something only Ethan could give. 2 weeks after Ethan's interview went viral, the phone finally stopped ringing. The headlines faded. The interviews ended. Life seemed peaceful again. At least for us. For my family. Everything was beginning to fall apart. One evening, I received a message from my cousin. "Have you heard about Sophia's company?" I hadn't. Until that moment. I opened a business news website. The headline immediately caught my attention. Tech startup faces major financial trouble after investors pull funding. My heart sank. Sophia's company had been preparing for its biggest expansion. But after months of declining sales and missed financial targets, several major investors had decided to withdraw millions of dollars in funding. Without that investment, the company was in serious trouble. Employees feared layoffs. Projects were put on hold. The board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting. Within days, the crisis became impossible to hide. Then another piece of bad news arrived. My father, Robert, had invested most of his retirement savings into Sophia's company. He believed it would secure his future. Instead, its value dropped almost overnight. Nearly everything he had worked for during 40 years of employment was suddenly at risk. For the first time in my life, I saw fear replace pride. That weekend, my parents called. I didn't answer. Then they texted. "Claire. Please. We need to talk." An hour later, they were standing at our front door. I opened it. Neither of them looked like the confident people who had stood on that ballroom stage only weeks earlier. My father looked exhausted. My mother had clearly been crying. Behind them stood Sophia. She looked completely different. The expensive designer clothes were gone. The confidence had disappeared. She couldn't even look me in the eyes. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, my father broke the silence. "May we come in?" I looked toward Ethan. He simply nodded. Of course. We invited them into the living room. No one touched the coffee Ethan prepared. The room felt painfully quiet. Finally, my mother spoke. "We know we don't deserve your kindness." My father took a deep breath. "We've made terrible mistakes." He looked directly at Ethan. "I'm ashamed of the way we treated you." Ethan remained calm. He simply listened. Then Sophia quietly whispered. "My company is collapsing. I've lost almost everything. My investors are leaving. I don't know how to save it." Tears rolled down her face. For the first time, there was no arrogance. No pride. Only desperation. My father looked at Ethan. "We know about your investment company. We know what you've built." He hesitated before saying the words that once seemed impossible for him. "Ethan. We need your help." The room became completely silent. After years of calling him a nobody. After years of mocking his future. The very people who had humiliated him were now asking him to save theirs. I looked at Ethan. His expression never changed. There was no smile of victory. No anger. No satisfaction. Only quiet compassion. He folded his hands and looked at each of them. Then he spoke calmly. I'll listen. But whether I invest depends on something far more important than money. At that moment, everyone in the room realized this conversation was no longer about business. It was about character. And before anyone left our house that day, they would learn a lesson no amount of money could ever buy. 3 days passed after my parents left our house. Neither Ethan nor I mentioned their visit. Life returned to its quiet routine. I went back to teaching history. Ethan continued managing his businesses as if nothing had changed. He never brought up my father's apology. He never mentioned Sophia's failing company. It was almost as though the conversation had never happened. Then, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang again. I opened the front door. My parents were standing there. Sophia was beside them. This time, they weren't dressed in expensive designer clothes. There were no confident smiles. No sense of superiority. Only nervous faces. My father removed his hat. Claire. May we come in? I stepped aside. Of course. As they entered, Ethan walked into the living room carrying a tray of coffee. For years, my family had barely acknowledged him. Now, every eye in the room followed him. My father slowly stood up. For the first time since I'd known Ethan, he extended his hand. Ethan. It's an honor to finally meet the man I should have respected from the very beginning. Ethan shook his hand politely. Thank you, Robert. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only kindness. My mother wiped away a tear. We judged you without ever knowing you. We saw your job, but never your character. I'm truly sorry. Ethan smiled gently. I appreciate your apology. I've never wanted anything more than honesty. Sophia lowered her eyes. She could barely speak. Ethan. I owe you an apology too. I spent years looking down on you. I thought success was measured by money, titles, and recognition. I was wrong. You've shown more dignity than I ever did. The room became silent. No one doubted her sincerity. Then my father took a deep breath. There is one more reason we've come. I already knew what it was. He folded his hands together. Sophia's company doesn't have much time. If nothing changes, it will shut down. He looked directly at Ethan. We're asking for your help. We know your investment firm has rescued struggling companies before. We're hoping. He paused, clearly struggling to say the words. That you'll consider investing in Sophia's business. Sophia's voice trembled. I'm not asking for charity. If you think the company has no future, I'll accept your decision. But please, at least give me a chance. I looked at Ethan. Years ago, these same people had laughed at him. Called him a nobody. Said he had no future. Now, they were asking him to become the very person who could save theirs. Ethan remained completely calm. He leaned forward and quietly asked one question. Tell me, if I were still just a warehouse manager, would you be sitting in my living room today? The question hung in the air. No one answered. Not my father. Not my mother. Not even Sophia. Their silence spoke louder than any apology. Ethan nodded slowly. I thought so. He wasn't angry. He wasn't mocking them. He was simply telling the truth. Then he offered a warm smile. I'll review Sophia's company the same way I review every business. I'll study the numbers. I'll evaluate the leadership. And I'll make a decision based on facts. Not family. For the first time that afternoon, everyone in the room understood something important. Ethan wasn't refusing to help. But he also wasn't willing to ignore principles simply because emotions were involved. As my family quietly prepared to leave, Sophia turned back one last time. There were tears in her eyes. "Thank you. Just for giving me a fair chance." Ethan smiled. Everyone deserves fairness. But trust must be earned. None of us realized it then. But Ethan's final decision would surprise everyone. Especially Sophia. The following Monday, Sophia arrived at Ethan's office. Not as my confident younger sister. Not as a successful entrepreneur. But as someone desperately hoping for a second chance. She carried a thick presentation folder under her arm. Financial reports. Business plans. Cash flow projections. Everything she believed would convince Ethan to invest. When she entered the conference room, she froze. There was no luxury. No unnecessary displays of wealth. Just a simple wooden table. A notebook. A cup of coffee. And Ethan. He stood, smiled politely, and shook her hand. "Good morning, Sophia. Thank you for coming." She nodded nervously. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity." For nearly an hour, Sophia explained her company's future. She described new products, potential partnerships, plans to reduce expenses. She answered every question Ethan asked. When she finished, the room became quiet. Ethan slowly closed the folder. "The business still has potential." Hope immediately appeared in Sophia's eyes. "You think it can survive?" He nodded. "Yes. But that's not the biggest problem." She looked confused. "It isn't?" Ethan folded his hands on the table. "Businesses can recover from financial mistakes. They recover every day." He paused before continuing. "But trust. Trust is much harder to rebuild." Sophia lowered her head. She already knew what he meant. Later that evening, my parents invited us to dinner. For the first time in years, no one argued. No one boasted. No one compared success. After dessert, my father finally asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "Ethan, will you invest?" The room became completely silent. Ethan looked around the table. He saw my mother. My father. Sophia. Then he quietly spoke. "Money can rebuild businesses." He paused. Then looked each of them in the eyes. "Character rebuilds families." No one moved. No one interrupted. His words settled over the room like complete silence. I looked at my parents. For a moment, they seemed ashamed. But as I watched their faces more carefully, something became painfully clear. They weren't looking at Ethan the way family should. They were looking at him as the solution to their problems. As someone who could rescue Sophia's company. Rescue my father's retirement. Rescue the future they feared losing. In that moment, I finally understood. Their apologies were sincere. But they were also convenient. If Ethan had still been the warehouse manager they once mocked, would they have come back? Would they have apologized? Would they have called him family again? Deep down, I already knew the answer. Ethan stood from his chair. I haven't made my final decision. If I invest, it will be because the business deserves saving. Not because we're related. And if I don't, it won't be because of the past. It will simply be a business decision. Sophia slowly nodded. For the first time, she accepted his answer without complaint. As everyone prepared to leave, I walked Ethan to the front door. I quietly slipped my hand into his. You knew all along, didn't you? He smiled. Knew what? That they were still thinking about themselves. He looked out toward the dark street before answering. People often confuse regret with transformation. Real change takes time. I leaned my head against his shoulder. I think I'm finally seeing things clearly. He kissed my forehead. And sometimes, that's the greatest wealth anyone can ever have. As my family's car disappeared into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story wasn't over. Because within the next few days, Ethan would make a decision that no one in my family saw coming. And it would teach all of us what true success really means. A week later, Ethan made his decision. He invited Sophia, my parents, and me to his office. No lawyers. No reporters. No cameras. Just our family. The atmosphere was quiet. No one spoke while Ethan placed a single folder on the conference table. Sophia looked at him nervously. I've been waiting all week. Ethan gave her a kind smile. I know. He slowly opened the folder. I've completed my review of your company. Everyone leaned forward. My father held his breath. My mother clasped her hands together. Sophia couldn't hide the hope in her eyes. After a long pause, Ethan finally spoke. I'm not investing. The room fell completely silent. Sophia lowered her head. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back her tears. My father looked disappointed. My mother quietly wiped away a tear. But Ethan wasn't finished. This decision isn't about revenge. He looked directly at Sophia. Your company has potential. But right now, it needs stronger leadership, better financial discipline, and time to rebuild trust. If I invested today, I wouldn't be helping you. I'd only be delaying the lessons every leader has to learn. Sophia slowly nodded. For the first time in years, she accepted responsibility without making excuses. I understand. I'm finally beginning to see where I went wrong. Ethan smiled. I believe you are. And that's worth more than any investment. My father looked down at the table. I spent years judging people by their job titles. I thought success only belonged to people with money and status. He looked at Ethan with tears in his eyes. I couldn't have been more wrong. My mother reached for my hand. I'm sorry, Claire. We celebrated your sister's achievements. But we never celebrated your heart. I squeezed her hand gently. I forgive you. The room became quiet again. I looked around the table. At my parents. At Sophia. At Ethan. Then I softly said the words that had been waiting in my heart for years. You didn't lose us because we lacked success. I paused. Then continued. You lost us because you never valued us. No one argued. Because everyone knew it was true. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Finally, Sophia stood and walked over to Ethan. She held out her hand. Thank you. He smiled. For what? For teaching me that real success isn't something you own. It's someone you become. Ethan shook her hand. I hope one day your company succeeds. But even more, I hope you become the kind of leader your employees can truly respect. As we left the office, the afternoon sun filled the streets with warm golden light. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hurt. I felt free. Months later, Sophia slowly rebuilt her business through hard work and honesty. Not because Ethan rescued her, but because she finally learned to stand on her own. My parents also changed. They visited us more often. Not to ask for money. Not to ask for favors. Simply to spend time together. Some wounds never disappear completely. But healing had finally begun. As Ethan and I walked hand in hand toward our car, I smiled. We hadn't won because we were wealthy. We hadn't won because someone else failed. We had won because we refused to let bitterness define our lives. In the end, my family realized they hadn't nearly lost a wealthy businessman. They had almost lost two people who had loved them unconditionally from the very beginning. And that was a loss no amount of money could ever replace.